Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I'm going to bring in my guest right away. His name is Michael Johnson. How are you tonight, Michael?
I'm very good. Hi, Lauren.
Thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Yes, Michael is a whistleblower. He was the director of public policy for Ble Shield of California for 12 years before resigning in 2015 to blow the whistle on the company. Before that, he served in a variety of public policy-related positions. In the mid-1980s, just out of college, he worked for Ralph Nader's group, Public Citizen. He also worked as an aide to John Garamendi when he served as insurance commissioner. And he's worked as an activist or consultant on nearly a dozen California ballot campaigns. How did you get interested in public service? Let's get back to the beginning with Public Citizen. What was your major in college, and what were you intending to be when you were younger?
I was always interested in public policy as a kid and interested in social justice. And I had actually interned for Ralph Nader's group between high school and college. And so, going to work there after college was just sort of a natural step for me. I mean, the entire time that I was at college, I knew that I would go and work for an activist group when I got out.
How was it working for Ralph Nader? I admire him very much, and he inspired me when I was younger myself.
I worked a little bit with him directly. I traveled with him on a few occasions, but a Public Citizen, I worked for the advocacy organization that he had created, but wasn't actually presiding over. And, we worked on anti-corporate campaigns, worked on campaigns against the auto insurance industry and campaigns to try and bring accountability to the banking industry. And, it was invigorating work. It was exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to be doing.
And how did you get into working for Ble Shield?
Well, so I went to work for Ble Shield. It's been now 15 years ago, and I went to work for Ble Shield is a nonprofit health plan. I had somebody that I knew from Democratic politics, a guy I had worked for when I worked for John Garamendi, was the vice president of public affairs at Ble Shield, and called me about a possible job there. And I thought, Ble Shield would be an opportunity to work for an organization that had the resources to really make a difference. And because Ble Shield was a nonprofit, it seemed to have a relatively progressive leadership. I thought this would be, another opportunity to make a difference for the better.
And were you able to do some good things while you were there before you got disillusioned with them?
I was. I mean, Ble Shield did have fairly, certainly for a health insurance company, fairly progressive public policy stance on a number of different issues. It was supportive of coverage expansion. I would sit in meetings with other health insurers and could be the progressive voice in that room with the backing of Ble Shield. So, as far as public policy went, in which, as director of public policy, that was my realm, I did feel that I could do some good work, but it was a different story on the business side.
So why don't you tell me what you noticed and what you tried to do internally before you went outside the organization?
What I noticed was Ble Shield as a business operated no differently than the for-profit companies did. It was all about making profits. It was all about growth. The executives were paying themselves virtually the same amount that for-profit company executives were being paid. There wasn't, and in many ways, Ble Shield was worse because there was less transparency than there is for a public, for-profit company, where they have to report to the SEC. Whereas Ble Shield, as a nonprofit, didn't have that responsibility, but at the same time, it wasn't really accountable in the way that a nonprofit should be accountable, and operated more sort of like a private company.
Mm.
And I, while I was there, kind of digging into this and trying to understand exactly what kind of a nonprofit Blue Shield was and why it was that Blue Shield didn't have to report to the Attorney General in the
Mm.
same way that most nonprofit organizations have to. And I sort of discovered this plan that had been in the works for over 20 years to essentially privatize Blue Shield, to turn Blue Shield from a nonprofit with a public benefit mission
Mm.
into a private nonprofit, the kind of nonprofit that a social club is, that has no obligation. It's a private social club is nonprofit, because it's not making any profits that it's distributing to investors, but it's a private organization that has no obligation to do anything for the benefit of the community.
And this is very similar, as I'm hearing this, to nonprofit charter schools. Only nonprofit charter schools get taxpayer dollars, and I guess Blue Shield gets premium holder dollars.
I'm not an expert on nonprofit charter schools, so I don't know how they're organized, but I'll bet you that your typical nonprofit charter school is probably is set up as a 501c3 organization. I imagine they're tax exempt. And as such, they do have fairly significant reporting obligations to the Attorney General. I mean, compare Blue Shield, for example, to Kaiser. Kaiser Permanente is a nonprofit health plan. It is tax exempt. It has to do much more extensive reporting to the Attorney General. It at least has to present a community benefit plan as part of its reporting to the Attorney General and to the IRS. I think that our kind of regulation of nonprofits is lacking, and that even organizations like Kaiser managed to kind of get away with a lot of for-profit type like conduct that they shouldn't. But at least Kaiser doesn't dispute that they have a legal obligation to benefit the public. Blue Shield takes the position that they have no legal duty to benefit the public, and so that was what I challenged them about when the leadership. I had a meeting with the CEO, and I put it to them, him and the rest of the leadership very directly, that look, that's not the way we talk about ourselves out in the public. We talk about ourselves as an organization that's dedicated to the benefit of the community. We advertise that we're different than for-profit organizations. Blue Shield had a slogan, for community, not for profit. And yet, these, and it's complicated, these legal machinations that have taken place have all been designed to avoid having to actually be accountable to the public in a legal way for actually providing benefit to the public. Plus, Blue Shield, as a business, operated no differently than the for-profit companies did. So what benefit did the public get from Blue Shield? And, they told me, that's all very interesting, Mike. Thanks for raising that, but we're happy with the way we're running the company, and we're going to continue doing it that way. And so I left.
And then you went to report this to a regulator. Which regulator?
Yeah, so I raised this with the Department of Managed Healthcare, which is within the Health and Human Services Department, the California Health and Human Services Agency. And there were a number of consumer groups that joined with me in pushing to have the DMHC enforce Blue Shield's public benefit duty. And there was about a 7-month long process where they considered the arguments that I and the consumer groups were presenting and the arguments that Blue Shield presented. And, I kid you not, Blue Shield literally made the argument that, hey, wait a minute, we're not that kind of a nonprofit. And they compared themselves in terms of their duty to benefit to the public to the Olympic Club, which people in the Bay Area might be familiar with. It's a very fancy private social club not far from Blue Shield's headquarters. And they argued that, they have no more duty to benefit the public than an organization like that does. And astonishingly, the Department of Managed Healthcare ruled in Blue Shield's favor and decided that, yes, Blue Shield is right. They don't have any obligation to operate for the benefit of the public. And even perhaps more importantly, what that means is they've essentially ruled that Blue Shield is now a private asset. Okay, Blue Shield is a huge company with a market value of at least $10 billion.
Wow.
So what that ruling means is that basically the regulator has made a determination that Blue Shield doesn't belong to the public. That Blue Shield is a private resource that belongs only to its board. And what that means is that if Blue Shield were to be acquired by another for-profit company, like happened with Blue Cross of California in the mid-90s, they're separate, Blue Shield and Blue Cross. In the mid-90s, Blue Cross was acquired by Anthem, became Anthem Blue Cross. And because Blue Cross was a nonprofit, the state required that the proceeds from the purchase of Blue Cross go to benefit the public. So $3 billion was turned over to the public, and that went to create endowments for the Wellness Foundation and the California Endowment. And that's because this idea that, look, a nonprofit belongs to the community. It can't just be converted to for-profit status to a private corporation without there being compensation to the public. Well, now, based on this ruling by the Department of Managed Healthcare, if Blue Shield were to put itself on the market and be purchased by, say, United Healthcare or some other big for-profit, the public would get nothing.
Who would get
Not
the profits?
a dime. It would be entirely up to the board of Blue Shield to decide what to do with that. And it's not clear to me that they couldn't pocket that if they wanted to.
Let me ask you a question about why you think that the Department of Managed Care did this. I use the term all the time, regulatory capture, where these industries get control of the agencies. And you see this on steroids right now in the Trump administration. Basically, he's putting in to head the agencies people who don't even believe in the mission of the agencies, are in the process of dismantling the agencies and making sure that the agencies don't even do the regulations that they're supposed to be doing. Why do you think, maybe knowing the personalities involved, did this agency make this very strange ruling?
Well, I think it's because Blue Shield has a very cozy relationship with the regulators. And that, which I knew about when I was at Blue Shield. One of the things, Blue Shield's very smart about developing these relationships. And one of the things that Blue Shield did was to provide funding for pet projects of the regulators. So Blue Shield uses its foundation and has provided millions of dollars in funding for projects that are important to the regulators. And these are projects, many of them are worthwhile projects, but the idea that an insurance company that is being regulated by the government is providing funding to those government agents that are regulating it is really troubling.
Yeah.
But the other thing about this decision was the regulator, the Department of Managed Healthcare, refused to provide any explanation at all for it. I mean, when the decision was announced, there was no explanation provided. I asked for one. I filed a Public Records Act request for documents that would reveal the reasoning behind it, and all they would provide to me were Blue Shield's arguments to them about why Blue Shield shouldn't be subject to any public benefit requirement.
This is very similar to the Department of Conservation's Division of Oil and Gas the Dogger, because the Department of Conservation has a dual mission. It has a mission to protect the resources and also to develop the resources.
Right.
So therefore, fracking and extraction of oil is actually something that they support. At the same time, they're supposed to be regulating it to protect the environment and protect public health. And what ends up happening, because of the outsized influence of the Western States Petroleum Association and how much money they spend on lobbying and how much money they spend contributing to candidates, is the agency was totally captured. And when the previous director of both agencies, the Department of Conservation and Dogger, tried to have more oversight over some of these fracking permits, because two employees were actually killed in an explosion, they got Jerry Brown to fire both of them and put in people to head those agencies that were much more favorable to the industry. And as a result, they let go so many permits that we found out they were injecting toxic fracking wastewater into drinking water aquifers 2,500 times. So I've seen this go on in other departments. What I'd like to know is, who was the head of that Department of Managed Care, and who was that person's boss who was the head of Health and Human Services?
So Diana Dooley is the head of Health and Human Services, and I am blanking on the name of the director of the Department of Managed Healthcare, which is crazy because I was battling. Oh, Shelley Rouillard. Shelley Rouillard is the director of the Department of Managed Healthcare. The Department of Managed Healthcare is an agency within the Department, the Health and Human Services Agency, which is headed up by Diana Dooley, and it's Diana Dooley's projects that Ble Shield has been providing funding for.
Wow!
And developed a very close relationship with Diana Dooley, and Diana Dooley is very grateful to Ble Shield for all of the terrific work Ble Shield has done on behalf of the state of California.
I remember this. I thought that the LA Times was doing a great job blowing the whistle on all this, even though the information I didn't realize was coming from you. Usually they're concerned about public perception, at the very least, the optics of something like this. Were any changes made, even though they weren't the changes that you wanted to have happen?
If it hadn't been for the LA Times reporting on this, I don't think the Department of Managed Healthcare would have taken this up at all and even conducted the examination that they did. But at the end of the day, no. And so the LA Times reported on this, reported on the decision. But it's a really complicated issue. It's a difficult issue for people to wrap their heads around. It doesn't really kind of hit people in the gut. And so, after the decision was made, Ble Shield turned around and sued me. I spent the next year essentially fighting off Ble Shield's lawsuit. I filed a motion to have it dismissed as a SLAPP suit. I lost at the trial court. The trial court ruled that it wasn't a SLAPP suit and could proceed.
Wow.
I appealed that to the Court of Appeals. That's now before the Court of Appeals. And, at the trial court level, when we were arguing over whether or not this was a SLAPP suit, and I was presenting my defense, my case to the court, Ble Shield managed to get the judge to not look at and prevent the public from seeing major portions of my testimony by claiming that they were attorney-client privilege, that the material was attorney-client privilege. So, this is kind of the same game that Cohen and Trump have tried to play. And so Ble Shield has abused, in my view, the attorney-client privilege to try and prevent me from even telling the court about what went on. And so it's really outrageous. We're appealing, that element of the decision as well at the appeals court. But it's been, so Ble Shield has made this a real personal fight.
How are you affording your defense? Do you have a defense fund that people can contribute to, or do you have lawyers that are helping you pro bono, or what?
I have well, the way the anti-SLAPP law works is that if the appeals court rules in my favor and dismisses the case as an anti-SLAPP suit, I get all of my attorney's fees paid. So I'm on the hook for quite a bit of money if I lose, but I'm confident that the appeals court will rule in my favor. The financial element of it has been a little scary and a bit of a strain, and but fortunately, I made a good salary while I was working for Blue Shield, probably a better salary than I should have, like everybody else there, all the other executives there. I don't have kids, and so I was able to save a good bit of money. And, I consider the work that I'm doing now really sort of part and parcel of kind of why I went to work for Blue Shield in the first place. So I sort of view the work I'm doing now as work that I've already gotten paid for.
What do they say inside Blue Shield about the eventuality of single payer? Because if that happens, that will put them out of business, won't it?
They're dead opposed to it. I mean, it is not, there's no support for single payer within Blue Shield or Blue Cross, no. And I was not advocating for single payer while I was working for Blue Shield. I've always, on a personal level, I've always felt that that's really where we need to end up. That the only way we're going to be able to deal with the rampant profiteering in our healthcare system is with single payer. This idea that we've got a competitive free market. Or that we ever could have a competitive free market in healthcare is just nonsense.
Explain that a little bit, because we were talking about that in the pre-interview.
Everybody has seen this, that you've got these hospitals charging these outrageous prices, and we've got too many, first of all, healthcare monopolies, where you've got hospitals joining together with medical groups, and they're basically the only game in town. Up in Northern California, Sutter has a virtual monopoly. There are many communities where Sutter is really the only hospital, or is the only major hospital in that community, and any health plan that wants to be able to sell insurance has to have that hospital in its network. And so the hospital's got it over a barrel and charges a fortune. Those costs get passed on to consumers. So you've got the problem where you've got these concentrated monopolies. It doesn't make sense. It's a little bit like a natural monopoly. In some communities, so small that it really only makes sense to have one hospital there. But if you've only got one hospital, that hospital now has a monopoly. And in other spheres of the economy where we have natural monopolies, you add to that the fact that with healthcare, just there's so many aspects of the product that make it very difficult for people to be comparison shopping for. Certainly people in emergencies situations aren't in a position to comparison shop like they can for a television set. You can't do it, and it's just very complicated. Trying to determine sort of where you can get the best value for an appendectomy. Well, that means you've got to find out who, you may find a doctor you really like, but that doctor has got admitting privileges to certain hospitals, and you're not going to be able to choose the anesthesiologist who's going to be in there. It just it just defies any ability to shop for a product like we do for others. And so I just I don't see how you can have, and I don't think there are any examples in the world of a properly functioning, competitive, free market for healthcare.
If we were to have a single-payer healthcare system where everybody's covered, everybody's in, nobody's out.
Yeah.
Do you see that they could have, like we have right now with public education, we still have private schools for rich people that want to pay extra. and they're still paying their taxpayer dollars to public schools, but they're sending their kids to a private school. Do you see that there could be, I don't know, maybe you'd call it a concierge doctor system working privately alongside a single payer system for those people that didn't want to have to wait, for instance? And also, they are going to prioritize certain things in a single payer system. Like if you're 80 years old, you probably shouldn't get a heart transplant, you know?
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think that's what's happened in Canada. That's what happens in Great Britain as well. You have the ability for people who want to pay, out of pocket for healthcare. They can do it. But I do think so. That can potentially create problems. I don't think you could prevent that. I think just constitutionally it might be difficult to prevent people from buying healthcare from willing providers. Having a basic system available to everybody where it is provided, is guaranteed by the government. Healthcare is guaranteed by the government, and this is the piece of single payer that a lot of people sort of gloss over. A real single payer system has to have a single payer. It's got to, the government has to be paying for healthcare. Has to be the one paying for healthcare. And effectively what that means is the government is determining the prices. If any so-called single payer system that doesn't involve the government determining prices is not a single payer system, and ultimately isn't going to solve the profiteering problem. So, we have, like with the Affordable Care Act, you could build on the Affordable Care Act by increasing the subsidies to a point where everybody is subsidized for healthcare, and the government is essentially guaranteeing healthcare for everybody, but it's still being provided by the private sector, and the prices are being determined the way they are today. That might be universal coverage, but it's not single payer, and
Right.
It's not going to provide care affordably.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm worried about when you hear certain people that are trying to flim-flam the voters when they talk about universal health care. It's not the same. Even Hillary Clinton's universal health care program in the 90s was nothing more than managed care, which is the same thing as Kaiser Permanente, which you were talking about earlier. So even though, she wanted to see everybody covered, it wasn't single payer. And I think you do have to take the profit motive out of it. You have to take administrative and well, there's going to be administrative costs, but the cost of Medicare is like 3%. You wouldn't have marketing, you wouldn't have the CEO salaries. And as I mentioned to you in the pre-interview, I've noticed that under Obamacare, these insurance companies have done very well. I mean, I've seen CEO salaries go up for the three big ones from 13 million a year to 15 million a year, and it's now 17 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
We got to wrap up. I wanted you to talk about two things. First, I wanted you to talk about the origin of Ble Shield, because you.
Yeah. Well, Ble Shield was started in 1939. And in 1939 it was started right after the election of Colbert Olson as governor of California in 1938. And he ran on a platform that included single payer, which in those days was called compulsory insurance. And so when he was elected in the fall of 1938, the California Medical Association was in an absolute panic that he was going to succeed in getting single payer enacted by the legislature. And they decided that the only shot they had of avoiding that fate was to present an alternative plan. And the alternative plan they came up with was voluntary insurance. Before Ble Shield, Ble Shield was one of the very first health insurance plans in the country. So there was no health insurance. When Colbert Olson was proposing single payer, there was no health insurance at all. And so they thought, the California Medical Association figured, well, if they set up a health insurance plan that people could pay for, and that way it wouldn't be controlled by the government, that would be enough to kind of peel off enough votes so the single payer plan wouldn't pass. Well, needless to say, they were successful. But when they did that, they set it up they dressed this whole thing up as a community benefit project. They said, look, we're doing this for the benefit of the community, set it up as a nonprofit, got tax exemptions for it. So in doing that, they basically made a deal that, look, this is for you, this is for the community. And now they're trying to renege on that deal.
We know that Gavin Newsom is going to be the next governor of California. We know that he has promised the nurses union that he's going to fight for single payer. He's going to fight for SB 562, if not exactly SB 562, something like it. He started to backtrack on the campaign trail, talking about universal health care. Roseanne DeMoro took him to the wood shop, trotted him out again. He had to, again, commit his support for single payer, SB 562. I'm worried that he's going to pull a Peter Shumlin, who also actually started to institute a single payer system in Vermont and then had to pull the plug. Seeing as that Gavin Newsom has taken $1 million from Ble Shield, what is your prediction about what's going to happen?
It's hard for me to say. I don't think that Gavin Newsom is going to be a crusader for single payer. If I had to predict what's going to happen. I don't think that's going to be high on his agenda. He's giving that indication. I mean, he's sort of indicated that this is something that is going to take years, and he's even talked like you suggested. He's kind of talked as if universal coverage is the same thing as single payer. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's even referred to the plan that he implemented in San Francisco as a kind of a single payer type of plan. Which
actually was Tom Amiano's plan that my friends in San Francisco told me he had to be dragged to support, kicking and screaming, and now he takes credit for it.
Just like the Affordable Care Act, I support the Affordable Care Act. I think it was a good step. I think the San Francisco plan was a step in the right direction, but it was a plan that essentially required employers to provide health insurance to their employees. That's what it was. It was not a single payer in the sense of having the government paying healthcare bills and therefore setting the prices that healthcare
and actually it was paid for by people like me who frequent San Francisco fine dining establishments.
That's right.
It's a 3% tax on your restaurant bill. I wish you great luck in your appeal.
Thank you.
And when it's decided, please let me know so I can have you back on and you can tell everybody what transpired.
Will do.
Thanks, all right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.